Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's EMBS seminar. Our speaker today is Dr. Sarah Giragosian, who is a full-time lecturer in writing and critical inquiry and affiliated faculty in English at SUNY Albany. Sarah is the author of poetry collections, Queer Fish, which won the 2017 American Poetry Journal Book Prize, as well as The Death Spiral and Mother, which co-won the Halcyon Prize. Dr. Giragosian has a BA in English from Holyoke College, an MFA in poetry from Boston University, PhD in English from SUNY. Welcome, Sarah.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Dr. Kendra, introduction, and thank you so much to Alfred's Environmental Studies Speaker Series. I'm so pleased to be here. Today I'm going to be talking about my scholarship on Elizabeth Bishop. This work came out of an NEH fellowship to study Bishop in the archives. But before I address her work, please bear with me. I'm going to define some terms and set up some theory. If you're interested in reading my article, it's in a volume called Elizabeth Bishop and the Literary Archives, published by Lever Press. Okay. I seem to have it. It's not able to change the slides.
I'm not sure why.
Oh, there we go. No, it worked. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to talk first about eco-poetry, which may or may not be a term that's familiar to you, but eco-poetry is sometimes found under the umbrella of nature poetry, but not all nature poetry is ecological. Eco-poetry engages with some of the following questions. What is the relationship between poetry and the environment? Can poetry be ecological? In other words, can it enact ecological concepts? And how can poetic language, which roots itself in the concrete world, help us to become better readers and interpreters of the physical world around us? Also, eco-poetry, unlike some forms of nature poetry, disrupts the pastoral or romantic ideal of nature, and instead is interested in disrupting the categories between nature and culture. But my favorite definition of eco-poetry comes from Juliana Spar, her volume, Well Then There Now. She herself is a poet and critic, and she writes, even when nature poetry got the birds and the plants and the animals right, it tended to show the beautiful bird, but not so often the bulldozer off to the side that was destroying the bird's habitat. And it wasn't talking about how the bird, often a bird which had arrived recently from somewhere else, interacted with and changed the larger system, the small part of the world we live in and on. So eco-poetry might take as its material a wastewater site, as you see in this slide, or even a landfill, right? A space that is environmental, but is not in any way pristine. It's been disrupted in some way by human intervention. Also, the Anthropocene. So this is a term that helps us to situate work of this moment. This is a term that was adopted by the Nobel Prize winning geologist Paul Crutzen to designate how our current geological era has been shaped by humans. So our influence on the ecosystem is now so far-reaching that we have become a global force of nature, altering geological systems and dominating lands. So the onset of this period is contested. Some cite the Industrial Revolution as its moment of inauguration, while others say that it dates back to the beginnings of agriculture. But now, in the midst of the sixth mass extinction, climate change, and multiple ecological crises, one could reasonably argue that there is a crucial need to be able to think in multiple timescales. And my intervention is that I think poetry, which roots itself in metaphor, can do some of this work of helping us to think through deep time and vast temporal strata. So eco-poets and critics have discussed at length as well that post-lyric poetry in the Anthropocene seems to be well suited to help us form a meaningful response to large-scale temporal and physical phenomena of our age. Tim Morton calls this phenomena hyper objects. In other words, these are entities of such vast temporal and spatial dimensions that they defeat traditional ideas about what a thing is in the first place. So here's what I think of as a kind of iconic image of the Anthropocene. So what you're looking at is an image of Beijing in 2014. You can see the skyline is so covered in smog that the city decided to put up this image of the sun so that residents on their way to work or wherever could still have at least the psychological benefits of seeing the sunrise. But clearly everything is so shrouded with fog. A few more things I wanted to say about the Anthropocene and deep time. So Stephen Jay Gould reminds us that deep time presents a problem of perception and imagination. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and it's a temporal kind of entity that is so vast that we need to rely on metaphor and science to conceptualize it. He says it can be understood only as a metaphor. So how might poetry, with its purchase on affect, the imagination, and metaphor lend itself to thinking through deep time and the ecological crisis? And I just wanted to include that humans represent just 0.01% of all life, yet have destroyed more than 83% of all wild animals and plants. And this is from a couple of years ago, so I'm sure that has even changed. I want to also introduce the term geopoetics. So geopoetics is a term that was inaugurated by Harry Hess, geologist. He wanted to open an imaginative field for conceptualizing the spreading of the seafloor in continental drifts. And in his writing, he encouraged readers to inhabit a poetic frame of mind and suspend their disbelief when learning about this concept, learning about his hypothesis about continental drifts. So this term is really enabling, I think, for thinking about poetry that is geological and that allows us to kind of enter a space of speculative imagination. So rather than striving merely for the mastery of knowledge, geopoetry understands inquiry as an opportunity to be swept away by wonder's animating currents of possibility, while equally valuing intuition and empiricism, affect, and materialism. Okay, so now we're moving into one of my favorite poets, Elizabeth Bishop. Bishop is someone who's often been read as a poet of intimacy, not a poet of the Anthropocene, although that's starting to change. If you are familiar with her work, there are many references, in fact, to deep time, but it's often in her less popular work or in her drafts and fragments. There was a volume published by Alice Quinn several years ago that published her material that was not included in her collected works. It's really her drafts and fragments. And I really can trace an interest in deep time and geology in many of those works. We see that in poems like The Mountain, The Blue Pencil, Crusoe in England, Verdigris, and Museum. And I just wanted to highlight this excerpt from this one poem, Vague Poem, which is a love poem about the Rose Rock, which you can see in this PowerPoint. She writes, faintly I can make out, perhaps, there was a secret, powerful crystal at work inside. I almost saw it, turning into a rose without any of the intervening roots, stem, buds, and so on, just for it to rose and back again. So in that excerpt, you can see her straining to visualize deep time and the formation of this crystal. Again, this is offered up in many ways as a hyper object, right? Something that happens over significant a significant temporal span. Okay, so Elizabeth Bishop's The Mountain is an understudied poem. It was written in 1952. You do have handouts, which includes the poem. I'm sorry, the script is so small, a little microscopic, but hopefully you can get a sense of The Mountain. I see it as a critical precursor in archival studies and geopoetics, insofar as it casts the mountain into a repository of the past. It is an archive of the earth, essentially. And it's an archive that can be read through the geological discourse of what I would call vibrant matter. This is a term that is introduced by Jane Bennett, introducing the idea that matter is alive. It can, in fact, evolve and change. It is not static. So in 1952, Bishop found herself settling into life in Brazil with her lover, Loura de Mesquita Soares. This was a productive period for Bishop, one in which she was harvesting memories of Nova Scotia and using that material mainly in prose. As Brett Millier notes, Bishop found it odd that she should have total recall about Nova Scotia in its theological mirror image, Brazil, but she did. For Millier, the mountain is a poetic exploration of Brazil in her early years there and is her weakest published poem. However, I think this poem is critically interesting when read in the context of geochronology, or the science of earth time, whereby the earth is read as an archive. Perhaps a geopoetic reading also enables a more generous approach to the poem than Millier's. Okay, so in my work in the archives, the Bishop Archives at Vassar College, I found 9 drafts and several fragments of the poem housed at Vassar, in which one can see Bishop attempting to work out the order of stanzas and lines, indicating that she ran the poem through several permutations before settling on a version that she was satisfied with. In all versions of the poem, the mountain is stymied by the limits of myopic, close reading. Even in what appears to be an early draft, entitled Mountains Complain Continuously, where Bishop had a collage of stanzas, but nothing close to the narrative that she would settle on. In the published version, in the complete poems, the phrase by reading stands alone at the top of the page. The challenges of reading an environment and reading the other are the base notes of the poem, and the trope of misreading is extended throughout the published poem. The inability of the mountain to read itself or its environment is also an existential crisis. In the Anthropocene, one might argue that we share the same ineptitude. In the second and third stanza, we learn that the mountain experiences sensual privation and discontinuity from its environment. Quote, an open book confronts me, too close to read in comfort, and that valleys stuff impenetrable mists like cotton in my ears. In a preliminary draft, a bland book opens against me, while in another, a bright book opens against me. So in each version, without the context of the human other, the mountain cannot understand itself or the phenomenological world without a constitutive intersubjective system. In a more ecological idiom, we may read the poem as a dramatization of the first law of ecology, which states that all organisms are interdependent. So much so that introducing a change in a system or even a single organism can affect all. So I'll read you the version that was published in her complete poems. The mountain. At evening, something behind me. I start for a second. I blench, or staggeringly halt and burn. I do not know my age. In the morning, it is different. An open book confronts me, too close to read in comfort. Tell me how old I am. And then the valley stuff, impenetrable mists like cotton in my ears. I do not know my age. I do not mean to complain. They say it is my fault. Love that little pun there. Nobody tells me anything. Tell me how old I am. The deepest demarcation can slowly spread and sink like any blurred tattoo. I do not know my age. Shadows fall down, lights climb. Clambering lights, oh children, you never say long enough. Tell me how old I am. Stone wings have sifted here with feathers, hardening feathers. The claws are lost somewhere. I do not know my age. I am growing deaf. Bird calls dribble, and the waterfalls go and wipes. What is my age? Tell me how old I am. Let the moon go hang, the stars go fly their kites. I want to know my age. Tell me how old I am. I'm going to skip that. So read poetically, Bishop's lyric becomes an apostrophe for a human other. And it's written from the perspective of the speaker mountain. It's called a persona poem. Her mountain is alive, it's inspirited, it's a persona that, in the tones of a mentally deteriorating elder, seeks answers about its age, and by extrapolation, its identity. It's a poem about the desire to be read accurately by someone else, a perspective we require in order to access even our own origins, right? We all have to ask our parents at some point in time, what was our infanthood like? You know, what was it like when I was born? Moreover, in its concerns with deep time and the ways in which humans can operate as readers and interpreters of geologic activity, the mountain may be read as a poem about the Anthropocene. So the mountain elderly on the age of senility complains, I am growing deaf, the bird calls dwindle, but it's apologetic about its grievances. I do not mean to complain, they say it is my fault. A fault, of course, is not only a flaw, but also a geological term, meaning the planar fracture in rock that results from the action of plate tectonic forces. Earthquakes are the result of sudden movements of faults, and movement along faults can cause seismic uplifts, which contributes to the formation of mountains. Significantly, this was a critical insight for Charles Darwin during his voyage on the Beagle, when he experienced an earthquake in Chile in 1835. Applying James Hutton's theory of uniformitarianism, the theory that the same geological processes that occurred in the deep past continue to occur in the present, Darwin inferred that the mountain range had been lifted incrementally by many earthquakes over many millennia. So what's interesting is that Darwin, a scientist, was an important influence for Bishop. In fact, some of the poems provides a powerful intertext to her, some of his work rather provides a powerful intertext to her poems. And her marked copies of The Voyage of the Beagle and the autobiography of Charles Darwin, which are housed at Harvard, that's my next script, revealed that she was aware of the significance of Darwin's geological insights. Moreover, she saw poetic potential in his work, and she was actually lineating his prose, turning it into poetry. So Bishop had brought Darwin's writing with her to Brazil, reading them closely and marking several passages from The Voyage of the Beagle. One of the marked passages includes Darwin's meditation on the action of geological forces over a span of deep time, which, quote, stupefied the mind in thinking over the long, absolutely necessary lapse of years. It's important to note here that Darwin's theory of origins was grounded in a conception of deep time that had originally been articulated by John Hutton. In the late 18th century, Hutton first conceptualized deep time in his initially maligned, but ultimately revolutionary text, Theory of the Earth. Unlike the prominent thinkers of his time, Hutton disavowed catastrophism, the widely accepted theory of the day that the Earth was shaped by sudden and short-lived events. Hutton's discovery occurred out of a combination of close reading and inference. Such inventive reading, however, was perilous. Scorned by the scientific community for his theories, Hutton is nevertheless significant in the story of deep time and Darwin's theory of evolution. Picked up 50 years later, Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology embraced Hutton's worldview and theorized gradualism, the theory that Earth changed by slow, imperceptible increments over time. That vision was later adopted by Darwin, and he brought it with him on his voyage of the Beagle. And he began to adopt Lyell's worldview, which was iconoclastic in an age when many embraced creationism. Despite being indoctrinated in creationism, Darwin, seeing the Earth through Lyell's paradigm, through his geopoetic vision perhaps, he saw evidence of gradualism in the Earth's crust. So the lineage that I have traced is critical in understanding the framework for Darwin's theory of origins. He posited that the Earth was not as young as had been thought by creationism. And he also theorized the idea that evolutionary progress happens gradually over eons. In other words, Darwin's geological understanding was the bedrock of his evolutionary theory. Significantly, what Bishop would later extol in an oft-quoted letter to her friend Anne Stevenson was, quote, a beautiful, solid case being built up out of Darwin's endless heroic observations, which was predicated on a geopoetic mode of seeing the Earth against the dominant ideology of the time. So in the poem, Bishop imagines the role of the human against fossilization and the temporal vista of deep time. Given our brief span on the planet, we are akin to children, a word that you find in the poem, who haven't been able to calibrate the geologic timescale with total accuracy. With older rocks still being discovered, the task of translating the geologic record is incomplete. Here are index fossils. With older rocks still being discovered, the task of translating the geologic record is still incomplete. I'm sorry. As the structural geologist Marcia Bajornard has written, using the metaphor of reading to describe the challenges of dating the geologic record. And notice the archival language being used here. Pages, if not entire chapters, of the Earth manuscript remain undiscovered, and passages from many known sections have not been fully deciphered. So the fossil record is fragmentary and still being unearthed. And interestingly, Bishop imagines an Earth that does not have recourse to its record. It requires the human to help translate its meaning. In the final stanza of The Mountain, Bishop returns to a cosmic framework. Let the moon go hang, the stars go fly their kites. I want to know my age. Tell me how old I am. In deferring resolution, the mountain is suspended in doubt. How do we read the appeal of the final stanza? Rhetorically, it's possible to read it as a gesture of despair or an attempt to reconcile the self's own opacity with the cosmic opacity. In the mountain, there's a desire to see the invisible, to discern the language and temporality of the geological, which moves too slowly for the human eye. However, recall that Darwin, Lyell, and Hutton were able to envision geological time even despite the temporal limitations of their own human scale. And they did that through metaphor and through an imaginative vision. So materializing that vision for us, Bishop's poems invite a process of reading that turns earthly archive into a sensual experience. Such a reading is epiphanic, even erotic, and can be accessed by the general reader should they enlarge their scale of inquiry beyond the human. However, Bishop calls The Mountain slight when she sent it to the New Yorker for consideration. In her letter, Bishop told the editor, Catherine White, that she wanted to send The Mountain to Poetry, which is a really esteemed poetry journal, calling it, quote, a little too elliptical for you. The elliptical nature of the text perhaps speaks to some of the difficulties of communicating scientific concepts through lyric poetry, especially when the poem is directed to a readership that tends to misread animism merely as folklore. The Mountain is demonstrative of Bishop's geopoetics, which are animated by the continuous process of discovery that art and science might share, as well as the ontological questions that we raise. As Tobias Menley and Jesse Oak Taylor note in Anthropocene Reading, Literary History in Geological Times, geologists have often relied on imaginative ways of knowing, since the field deals with scales of space and time unavailable to human experience. Consequently, geology, they contend, has never altogether transcended its province in imaginative narrative forms. Darwin's work, like Bishop's poetry, takes a processual, tentative, and adaptable approach to knowledge, in contrast to any system of knowledge that would seek to explain nature without recognizing the limitations of its field, its all too human perspective. As Zachariah Picard notes, a scholar of Bishop, she was drawn to Darwin's patient, accumulative approach to science. He did not advance his ideas through inductive reasoning, but rather determines meaning as he proceeded. While absolute knowledge suspends science's processes of discovery indefinitely, the methods of geology may have offered a flexible mode of poetic inquiry for Bishop. And I think in many ways, we see that geological imagination in her own poetics. We have a little time left. I thought I would share with you one of my own poems, kind of inspired by the mountain. One thing that I'm trying to do in this poem is to perform the experience of being caught up in deep time. This is also a love poem, and it's called Gift of Ammonite. So, as you see in the slide, ammonites are those spiral fossils. I lose my way again in a chamber of ammonite, fossilized helix, a blink of an eye in time that dizzies my mind back to an ancient seabed, to eons of embedment, heat, and pressure, to this casting of carbonized spiral in my palm. Every crenulation, every coil, an excursion into Earth's memory. Listen, if you dip your ear to the bends of the ocean floor, you can hear the earth humming. If you tilt the swirl of stone to the whirl of your ear, you can hear evolution's clear refrains, its tweaks and adjustments scaled to the frequency of tadpole, shrimp, jellyfish, nautilus, and dreams. Listen for ruptures in time signature. Wait the way you waited for her love to arrive. Okay, and that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions or respond to comments. I know it's a lot of material, but yeah, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts.
Use this for anyone's question.
Yeah.
Hold on one second. I'm going to have you use the speaker.
I am curious how, and like studying this, and because I feel like it's so niche, and that's curious of how you come to this topic.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I've always been interested in Elizabeth Bishop's poetics. I've been studying Bishop since I was in college. She hasn't been read as an eco-poet or a poet of the Anthropocene until very recent years. I think that my own writing in eco-poetry, my own eco-poems kind of intersected with my interest in Bishop. And I also, I like a challenge. So, taking the time to go to Vassar and read these understudied poems or archival materials, some of which have not been published, I was just very interested in seeing the way that she is a poet working with the sciences. As I said, she's often a poet read as a poet of intimacy, of even domesticity. And I think that there's more to say about Bishop as someone fascinated by Darwin. I mean, she was lineating Darwin's prose. So that to me is really, really remarkable. And at this particular moment in time, I think the ecological crisis demands that we think in an interdisciplinary way. And so any work that really bridges poetry and humanities with the sciences is really interesting to me. And I just want to revive Bishop as a poet who has a lot to say about science. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah.
Interested in
Yeah, so I'm also interested in queer eco poetry. Nature is often read as heterosexual, but there are so many instances, over 900 species, I believe, demonstrate homosexual behavior in the animal kingdom. And so I'm very interested in queer ecopoetics. There is something queer about these temporal questions that the Anthropocene kind of inspires, I think, right? Because our ways of thinking through deep time are really profoundly metaphorical, right? And so that suggests to me that that we need metaphor, and we need kind of a poetic, imaginative vision in order to think about time at a scale that extends beyond human, right? Like the human species is only a blip of time on an earthly time scale. So I'm really, in that poem, I'm thinking about how do we queer time? How do we think about time beyond kind of a linear framework or a narrative framework, but that is more convoluted and strange. Yeah, thanks for that question.
I was wondering if you read any of the poetry by Linda Beers, who's a current published poet by now. She's written a lot about Darwin. If you read The Ghost Trio, there's a lot about Darwin in there, a lot about science and history in there. It's really interesting. And she's really curious as a writer. I saw little bits in your poem there. You might draw from it.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'll just read the poetry. Wounds of Beard.
It's a B-I-E-R-D-S is how she's.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think I do agree that the community practice is very crucial. My question kind of relates to maybe the current and the contemporary knowledge studies and research where they look back into researchers look back into historical record of art of Chinese school painting or folk songs or poetry or material of what that season will have of material like. Whereas this is art that utilizes information from practical research. Do you have sort of examples or kind of ideal way of looking at the collaboration where this art practice for poetry and art forms can be brought back into the scientific process to be used as a collaborative, whereas the other way around art is using data for ecological recognition as a point of departure.
I'm sorry, there's a little bit of an echo, so I just want to make sure I got the question accurately. You're asking about the interdisciplinary kind of conversation between science and poetry?
Yes, and poetry and art where does helping scientific research use poetry as or art as a way to contribute to the conversation or kind of use it as data or the collaborative act.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I mentioned in my presentation, Harry Hess, who theorized the spreading of continental drifts, in order to introduce continental drift and the spreading of the seafloor, he asked his readers to inhabit a poetic frame of mind. He used this term geopoetics. And so there is an example of science relying on poetic frameworks in order to introduce a really revolutionary idea. In terms of, I mean, poetry, I think, can speak to can speak to science in many significant ways. I mean, science often has a pretension to objectivity and to truth. but, a lot of scientific theories have an element of bias in them, right? And whether we're talking about like, the way that racist theories have underpinned certain scientific discourses, or pseudosciences like social Darwinism. Poetry can, I think, do the work of deconstructing some of those biases and helping us to think through or even critique the sciences in a productive way. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you.
Really well, I wanted to ask about the choice of the Ammonite as the fossil in your poem. Was that choice because of the physicality of the Ammonite spiral or what? Why the Ammonite?
It's just so cool. Right? I mean, there's an aesthetic quality to the Ammonite that I love, but also that spiral. The spiral is one that's repeated in nature over and over again, right? So I think there's like a elegance to that. And so, yeah, that particular fossil just speaks to me, especially when thinking about inhabiting deep time. There's something about that crenulated form that just was generative for thinking about deep time and about love.
Hello, I was curious about your perspectives on the term of hyper, like a that's sort of extended by climate change and much greater in that world. How does that interact with poetry as like a ephemeral media, and how does it interact with your work, especially with other entities like Spiral or other activities of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think that metaphor is really enabling for poets to think through deep time, right? I mean, Tim Morton does say that these objects are so vast that we do have to think about breaking it down into images and metaphors that allow us to conceptualize, 4.5 billion years, the age of the earth, right? And so I think what's exciting about metaphor is that, clearly it's a human framework or a kind of a human concept, but we're also able to think beyond the human metaphor. Metaphor is tricky because you're transferring one object to another likeness. We talk about tenor and vehicle when we talk about metaphor, and there's something potentially essentializing about that. And modern poets, have done a lot of important work kind of deconstructing the more essentializing aspects of like, again, human thought of I think one thing that I've learned from modern poetry is that there are ways to kind of highlight the constructedness of human thinking, of human metaphor. So even though while I rely on it, I'm also always a little bit ambivalent about it and think about how it can be productively undermined. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Going back to the mountain, humans are mentioned in there, the children one of the lives, right? And humans we're just really, really small, live at biologically, and we're not here for about 100 just like find ways to make sure. So
that's about as far from gradualism as you can. We're having a huge impact on oceans and atmosphere and land forms. And so it's almost more akin to not the gradualism of but more, I don't know what the catastrophism or punctualism, if goal would name it. And she also alludes to that early in the poem, when she says that I start for a second, I blench, I stagnate, halt and burn. I think these short, fast movements, these little earthquakes or whatever it is. So again, that's another one of those. I don't know, I read it as a catastrophic change. So as if she sees these long periods of not much with these blips of time, fast changes. I don't know if you're reading it the same way.
No, I think that makes really good sense. I mean, I think what I'm really fascinated by this tension or this paradox that the mountain, yes, I mean, it is a perfect icon for deep time and for gradualism in some ways, but at the same time, in order to understand itself, the mountain seems to rely on other organisms, including the human, to read itself. It's that paradox I think is really fascinating. Tell me how old I am. And it seems to me that maybe not just the children, the humans, but maybe also like the fossils, the wings that have subsisted here, the feathers, other organisms as well. Yeah, just it is really a fascinating poem. But you're right, like the really attenuated lines, even their rhythm seems kind of akin to a kind of catastrophism, right? And you know, what is causing the mountain to blench? I don't know, it's mysterious, it's interesting. Yeah, thanks for that reading.
We're not to make this sense. I think ultimately what I'm curious about is your artistic and creative process and like how you are positioning yourself and thinking about team time and like how are you working through that, like what are maybe the pitfalls like I see that you're like holding on with other artists, but like is there a practice of going out into the world? Like what's it? I'm just curious like about like for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely, I think my engagement with the environment really informed my work. I used to volunteer as a wildlife rehabber, and that experience was amazing. It also generated a lot of persona poems through the perspective of those birds. Specifically, we worked with birds at my wildlife center. But even that too is like challenging, right? Because how do I speak for another organism that has a completely different sensorium than I do, right? But it's that space of mystery and paradox, I think, that is really generative to poetry. And there are things that we can do as poets when we are speaking on behalf of other creatures that draw attention to the fact that our thinking is contrived, even while basing it in science, which again is a tricky tension to kind of untangle. But yeah, I think I'm someone who is really drawn to facts, to accuracy, to biological meanings, but at the same time, I know that as a human being, my perspective is so limited. And so it's that space of tension that I think it's really interesting for either poets. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And wanted to thank you also for leaving so much time for questions, because that's is equally fascinating.
These questions were wonderful. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
And I can't remember if we mentioned that this was co-sponsored with the English department. I want to thank you guys as well for the questions that came.
Thank you.
What up?